Good everyone. My name is Terry Potter. I'm an attorney with Husch Blackwell, and I'm a part of their healthcare practice group, specializing in primarily traditional labor matters. And I'll be one of the presenters today. Joining me is Rufino Gaitan, who's out of our Houston office, and like me, he specializes in healthcare matters, and in particular, labor-related issues for healthcare clients. He's also an expert in OSHA, so actually you get two bites at the apple with Rufino, which is a rarity these days where everybody specializes so much. But we're going to be discussing growth and union organizing as it continues to this date. There's no question that this has been an ongoing issue since the board took jurisdiction over healthcare employers back in the 70s in terms of just a vast amount of growth and organizing in a healthcare setting. So today's objectives, just to lay it out for you here, is to give you a better understanding of the legal framework in which this whole process works, to give you a better idea of some best practices to use when navigating this space, knowing what to expect if employees organize in a general sense, and also understanding the value and, again, the not so subtle messages employees send to their employers daily in terms of how you can be better prepared for this situation. We have a lot of industry demands in the healthcare setting. In particular, there's been a lot of growth in the healthcare area, lots of job opportunities, and less than 14% of the U.S. healthcare workers are union members. So in other words, there's a large grouping of employees that these unions can focus on and obtain union dues money from. And don't be deceived. The primary goal for organizing for these unions is to get more in the way of dues money. That's how they survive, plain and simple. So keep that in mind. One of the key issues why employees even seek out a union is job satisfaction. Again, probably not an eye opener for any of you, but all this is a good reminder. Look, there's not going to be any huge eye openers in today's presentation. This is about making sure that you're doing the right things going forward and keeping on top of the issues. And that means being diligent and keeping this top of mind, especially if you're in HR, because the unions involved in healthcare are very savvy, very, very savvy, unlike other industries. So they will take advantage more so than other unions and know the right things to say at the right times. What they're going to be looking for are employees who come to them with job satisfaction concerns, where there's low employee morale, retention problems, maybe there's a PR image, things of that nature, and they will utilize that to try to sell their services, to say that a union is the next best step for these employees. And that's just sort of the standard story in terms of how all this gets started. So, keep that in mind when you think about this, that it's really about being diligent in terms of satisfying your employees, be it getting feedback through employee surveys, having, morning meetings. If you're in an acute healthcare facility, the nurses meetings every morning, those sorts of things make a huge difference. And we'll be talking about all that going forward. Rufino?
Thanks, Terry. So I have the pleasure of just quizzing you here real quick with a poll. So if you wouldn't mind answering the question, do you have employees who are represented by a union? Yes, no, or not yet? All right, give it a few more seconds. We've got about a quarter of you responding so far. All right. Okay, let's see where we stand. Okay, this is a pretty good breakdown. So little over a third of our audience has at least some portion of their workforce represented by a union, and the majority say no, and a few say not yet. Part of the reason that we ask this question is it's just a good opportunity for us to remind our audience that a lot of the issues we're talking about will apply to you regardless of whether you have employees represented by a union or not. The NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, applies to all employers that are involved in interstate commerce, which generally means everybody. And so those protections that we'll talk about and some of the things that we'll discuss will all apply to you. And certainly some of the prevention issues that we'll discuss are going to be key to those of you who do not currently have unionized employees. So in terms of trends that we are seeing, there's a lot of activity that's been going on, and we've been able to sort of spot some trends over the last several years. So I want to talk a little bit about those issues. But as Terry was mentioning, employees organize generally because there's some sort of level of dissatisfaction with the workplace. And specifically, one of the things that we hear quite a bit during organizing campaigns is employees feel like they lack a voice in their workplace, right? So whether it's their wages, their benefits, how vacation is scheduled, all of those things, if they feel that they don't have a right to participate in the decision-making process, that is usually one of the key drivers towards seeking union representation. Job security. Now, this one typically takes, the form of employees being terminated for no reason or no good reason, or maybe it's a layoff issue, right? If it's an economic downturn situation, they feel that having a union will give them more protections in the event of those issues arising. Perceived lack of respect and dignity, again, that kind of goes hand in hand with the lack of voice in the working conditions, or it might be inconsistency and favoritism in the way that the employer is administering its policies. We use inconsistency and favoritism and not discrimination or harassment because, it doesn't have to be unlawful for there to be an issue in terms of how employees perceive workplace policies being implemented. If there is a sense within your workplace, and sometimes a lot of these issues are just perception, they may not even be based in fact or objective reasoning, but if employees perceive that their management team plays favorites, or that some employees get to flout some of your workplace rules more than others, that creates a sense of, I need somebody to go in there and fight for me and to address these issues in a way that is fair for everybody. Although that's not typically the driving force behind union organizing efforts. It is a big issue in a lot of campaigns for sure, but they are usually, generally speaking, most employers, and certainly in today's economic climate, are trying to pay market rates for their labor, right? So it's not necessarily that you're paying less than a competitor, but all of these other factors play into those issues, and they just give employees more reason to seek union representation. And then lastly, and this is a big one, deficient supervision, right? So what does that mean? It might mean a lack of feedback, good or bad, to employees, right? It can take the form of issues being raised to supervisors that don't get addressed or are never satisfactorily resolved for the employee. There are a lot of ways that this issue, takes form, but it is one of the big issues that we hear employees talk about during campaigns. So, for those of you who are employ physicians, which ideally should be most of you since this is a healthcare webinar, you know, one of the trends that we've noticed is after the pandemic, there were lots of mergers of major healthcare systems. That has led many physicians to think or feel that the mergers and the consolidation of management and it's disrupted the way that a lot of doctors practice. They feel like maybe they're losing some degree of control over their practices. And it also means that a lot of these physicians who maybe previously were, partners or owners are now actually employees of an organization. What that means practically or from a legal standpoint is once those doctors become employees, unless they are supervisors, as that term is defined under the Act, the National Labor Relations Act, they are also then subject to the protections of the NLRA. And for a lot of doctors, unions are still out there asking them to consider unionizing. And if they are employees who are not supervisors, they have the same rights as your nurses or your pharmacists or your cleaning technicians to organize into unions. So we've seen a huge uptick in organizing activity for medical residents. As you can see on this slide, there's approximately 144,000 doctors who are in residency programs across the United States right now. Over the last 3 years, there has been almost a doubling of the number of residents who are now represented by unions. This is a pretty scary proposition for all of you who have residency programs. And the reason that it should be scary is this is a great sort of feeder system for unions, right? If you get a resident to organize, not only are they going to be represented during that residency, but that person, once they move out of that program, that is maybe your physicians are not unionized in general, but it gives them an inroads, it gives the unions an inroad into trying to organize your physicians in general, right? So it's ample opportunity, and like Terry was saying earlier, this is about driving up union dues, right? So the more inroads that a union can make in terms of creating membership opportunities, this is a great opportunity for them to do that. So with physicians in general, so non-residents, we're talking about similar, not quite as steep an increase in unionization rates, but over the last 15 years or so, we have seen those numbers go up as well. From 2014 to 2019, there was about a 26% growth in the number of physicians who are now represented by unions. So again, these are primary targets for unions because not only do they increase the amount of members on their rolls, but when you think of the compensation that a doctor makes versus a cleaning technician or even a nurse, for example, those dues are significantly higher for this group of individuals. And so they are, really attractive targets for union campaigns for unions. In terms of nurses, this is one that is a little surprising for me. There has been little change in the rates of union representation for nurses. Nurses were already on the higher end of the spectrum in terms of organized rates, and certainly in comparison to the general workforce, nurses are unionized at a higher rate. But where we've seen unions really show their value, at least from the employee's perspective here, is in terms of how aggressive they've been on strikes and other types of work stoppages. Through August of 2023, we saw a lot of strikes and other sort of work stoppages in the healthcare industry. In 9 of those strikes, there was a nurses union that was involved in leading that charge. So for those of you who have groups of nurses that are organized, this is a really big threat. Those nurses unions, they've done this before. This is not something that is new to them. They know when to be aggressive enough to address these issues. And so it's something that, you should always be cognizant of if you have nurses who are already unionized or represented by a union. And then pharmacists, we've also seen increases here. Generally speaking, though, it's in retail pharmacies. Staff pharmacist rates remain pretty low across the industry. You can see here that it's only about 8% of staff pharmacists who are represented by unions. However, as I said, in the amount of retail pharmacists who are seeking union representation. If any of you have been to a local CVS or a Walgreens or another pharmacy recently, you know that the staff at those pharmacies appears to always be overworked. The lines get longer and longer. At least it's been my anecdotal experience in my neighborhood. So what happens when staffing becomes an issue, right? If you're not getting sufficient support, and this applies across the industry, right? Nurses, same issue. There's a lack of nurses looking for work right now, or who have the qualifications that you're looking for. So hiring replacements or additional staff is a very big challenge that the industry is dealing with across the board. When you see that issue come up, it also goes into this, how can we address our working conditions on our own? If our employer isn't going to do it with our input, let's go seek out union representation. That's a lot of what we're seeing in pharmacies right now. It's really a staffing issue that's tending to drive a lot of those discussions for those employees. And I'll turn it back over to.
Thank you, Rufino. Next step in this review is the legal landscape. Before I jump into that, I also want to note in terms of the organizing by physicians in particular, that has a great impact on other employees in the workplace, whether it's a hospital setting, a medical clinic, or whatever. If the physicians organize, obviously that has a real impact on the other employees, the nurses, the other attendants, all the other staff members at that medical clinic or hospital. And the physicians are, let's face it, they're commonly looked up to by these other groups. And if they think the physicians are organized and it's a good idea, then they will also go down that road. So it's an issue in that sense too. So keep that in mind. In terms of sort of the legal landscape we have to deal with in this context, there's a single agency, the National Labor Relations Board, which functions under a federal statute, the National Labor Relations Act, which provides guidance in terms of how this organizing activity takes place. It's been around for a long time. There are a lot of rules and regulations on how this process should be utilized. And there are a number of tripwires for employers in particular in this context that can result in um, all sorts of bad acts being alleged by the union, which gives them fodder to complain about an employer who doesn't care what the law is. So that's why you have to be very careful when organizing takes place to reach out and seek legal counsel so that you don't trip over these tripwires and you don't create, frankly, all sorts of issues that you have to fight down the line. In general, the National Labor Relations Act, as this slide indicates, provides the employee's right to organize in the workplace. Or if they don't want to organize, it works both ways. But in general, the agency supports the employee's rights to organize, to ask questions, to attend union meetings, and so forth. So it's the fundamental statute that protects employees in this situation. Employers also have rights. They're not as strong as what the unions and the employees have in the way of rights, especially in certain administrations because of how the political structure, the political nature of the National Labor Relations Board. It's very much a political animal. The board members themselves are all political appointees. The general counsel, who acts as the chief prosecutor, is a political appointee. And those are the individuals who develop the policy and guidelines. And so what's frustrating for many employers is that the NLRB and the general counsel flip-flop on policy. 1 week, your policies on workplace issues can be X, and the following week they have to be Y, with no true legitimate reason for the change, other than the fact that it may be more beneficial for the unions and their ability to organize in the workplace. So that's probably the most frustrating part for most employers because of the back and forth that goes on between the various boards and the general counsel as to what the legal landscape is in this situation. We all like to have, the same rules apply across the board at the same time, but unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Okay, employer speech. Yes, the employer has a right to free speech in the workplace, but there are certain guidelines, and they've been universal for some time in this arena. You can provide facts. You provide all the information you want about the union, their strike history, their due structure, any criminal activity they were involved in, how many collective bargaining agreements they have in your area for the employees in question. Maybe they don't have any experience representing nurses. Maybe they have no experience representing physicians. You can provide all sorts of information to your employees about the union, nothing improper about that. And in conjunction with that, you can also provide your opinion about the union, such as, we don't think this is a good idea. This union has a history of, frankly, being all talk and no show, so that they are voted in and then they never get a collective bargaining agreement negotiated. It goes on for years and years, and the employees get extremely frustrated, and they end up decertifying or throwing the union out, or that the cost for obtaining a union is way too expensive. Union dues are, $50 a month. And what are you going to get out of that you don't already have through our own policies? So yeah, you can express opinions. You can also explain the rules that take place. In terms of how we even get to an election to vote on whether we want a union in the workplace or not. And this may be your own personal experiences with this particular union or unions in general. Again, that's all protected, and you're more than able to make those comments. What can't you talk about? Well, most of it's common sense, to be honest with you. Threats. Obviously you can't threaten employees with reprisals, discharge, discipline, whatever, for engaging in union activities. And the problem is that sometimes it's not so clear when they're engaging in misconduct that it's part and parcel of a activity in support of the union. So that can get you in trouble. So the number one issue for me in this situation is the second bullet point here, interrogation. You can't ask employees about their individual union activities. Hey, Joe, are you going to vote in favor of a union if that election comes up? You cannot ask that question. That law is clear cut. But obviously, it's one as a supervisor or a manager you think is the most relevant. Why in the world can I ask that question? That's very, very frustrating to most managers. Now, with that being said, you can ask them or tell them, rather, your opinion of the union, and oftentimes that will generate a response from them regarding what their intentions are. So you can't come into the back door through a legal method. Promises. You can't bribe your employees not to engage in union activities. You can't tell them, hey, look, I know you guys want us to change the benefit model for our health insurance. I hear what you're saying. I understand that you've sought out a union in this situation, but we're willing to do this. We're willing to give you the change you want if you drop this union activity. You can't do that. You simply can't. And then the last one, surveillance isn't so much of an issue anymore. This was more of an issue in the past when employees were going down to the VFW hall and having meetings and trying to organize. And so some manager would drive by and see which cars he could identify and maybe take down license plate numbers to see who was attending the meetings. These days, it's all done through social media. It's very hidden. It's very, very difficult to know when these campaigns start up. That's one of your biggest handicaps these days, is knowing when there's even a start. Sometimes you get an employee coming forward and coming into HR saying, hey, we think you should know about this. The employees are talking early and often about joining a union. And that will be the way you find out. It won't be by seeing them talking in the parking lot, having meetings, frankly, in the restrooms or in the lunchrooms and discussing matters of this nature. So, how do employees organize? Well, it's a convoluted process, but it all starts out, for the most part, with employees having to sign what's been referred to as authorization cards. They're simply a card about the size of an index card, which provides certain information or contact information, but also expresses a desire by the employee to be represented by the union. So that's how the process gets going. And why are those cards important? Because the NLRB says that before they will initiate the process to go to an election among any group of employees, at least 30% of the employees in the proposed bargaining unit in question, must sign authorization cards. Now, in reality, no union is going to take a matter to an election unless they have at least 50% of the employees signing those cards, and more likely 60%. because they want to win that election, and they're not going to waste their time if only 30% of the employees are willing to sign a card. That will get them nowhere. So, and the burden for the most part is going to be on the employees to go out and solicit those cards and get those signatures. So that's where
And Terry,
90% of the elections take place or initiated or through an authorization card process. Now,
Terry, this is probably a good point to it's almost like we planted this question, but we got a question in the Q&A about what if the NLRB finds an employer engages in prohibited conduct like a straw poll? What is the typical remedy? This is probably a good point to discuss a little bit of the CMEX decision, don't you think?
Yeah, probably is. So, folks, to make your life even more difficult, the NLRB has decided in recent months that they're changing their policy in which a union can come into the workplace without an election, no election whatsoever. All they have to establish is that the union has cards from a majority of the employees in the workplace, and the employer has engaged in a significant unfair labor practice. Now, they're probably going to, if they're going to an election, it's usually pretty easy to get an authorization card signed. A lot of it is a function of peer pressure. Oftentimes, these cards are obtained when they're in a meeting at somebody's home, et cetera, where someone's leaning over your shoulder saying, yeah, go ahead and sign. So a lot of people sign who really don't have an intent to be represented by the union, but they sign anyway. So that hurdle's overcome. The next hurdle is the employer engages in an unfair labor practice, like the question comes in. What can be the remedy? And it can be a bargaining order where the election is bypassed. The board says, well, we've got more than 50% of the employees signing cards. There's been a significant unfair labor practice. Therefore, we're going to bypass the election and we're going to force the union on the employees because of the unfair labor practice situation. That's where we're at now, folks. Elections are basically being wiped off the map because the standard to bypass the election now is so low. Again, 50% of the cards signed, majority status, and a significant ULP. Now, they define significant ULP a lot different than what I would. Their definition of a significant ULP is something as simple as a single rule that would violate the NLRA. One rule violation out of your handbook is sufficient in their mind to get a bargaining order, something that's never been the law since the NLRA's inception. So this creates another easy pathway for unions to organize your employees. And I hope that answers the question by the audience member. So another concern you should have in this situation is salting. That is a situation in which the employees actually plant somebody who is employed by the union to be an employee in the workplace and to organize the employees. And it's perfectly lawful. And you won't know about it. They'll have all the organizing accomplished before you know it, and have all the employees signing authorization cards and have a petition filed in short order if you're not careful. This doesn't happen that often anymore, but it's still a concern. And frankly, if I were a union these days, I would definitely do more salting, especially with the new policy about bypassing the election process. in attempting to get a bargaining order. Because that will expedite the process by having that insider organizing your employees and also be a source for information regarding potential violations, significant violations that could result in a bargaining order. Now, I know we're getting into the weeds a little bit here, but this is something which is a real game changer in this context. Sometimes employees will engage in strikes in an attempt to organize. I've never understood this very well. It's not very effective. But in particular, some unions think this is the way to go about organizing, that they get a number of the employees in support of organizing, and then they engage in either picketing activity or strike activity to force the employer to recognize the union. It doesn't work very well normally. It just doesn't. And you don't see it too much anymore because I think the unions have recognized that it's not an effective tool. Technology has made a huge difference in organizing. Employees no longer need to go down to the union hall to discuss matters, to sign an authorization card, to talk to somebody face to face. Video calls, private Facebook pages, chat rooms, all have taken over what used to be a very remote process. And again, it just makes it so much easier to organize in hiding in particular, so that they've got all their ducks in a row when they file that petition. So it's just a huge benefit. The election process is fairly straightforward. If there's a finding after a petition's been filed that an appropriate unit does exist at the employer's facility pursuant to the petition, that there can be an election, and usually this moves along very quickly. All this is done within a matter of weeks, folks. It's a very quick process. One of the fundamental questions in this situation is, what's the appropriate bargaining unit? The bargaining unit is a term of art used to describe the voting group. What group of employees are going to vote to see whether or not they want to be part of a union? And in NLRB jargon, that's a bargaining unit. Now, healthcare has some special rules regarding bargaining units. If you're in an acute care hospital setting, there are predetermined appropriate bargaining units. For example, all registered nurses have to be in their own separate bargaining unit. All physicians in their own separate bargaining unit. All professional employees except registered nurses and physicians in their own separate bargaining unit. All technical employees have to be in their own separate bargaining unit. Again, and there are some others. I'm not going to bore you with what's going on here, but there are very specific roles to be played in terms of what the appropriate bargaining unit is in an acute hospital setting. If you're not in an acute care hospital setting, like you're in a clinic, or if you're in an extended care center, then those specified bargaining unit rules don't apply. It's just a matter of whether or not there is sufficient community of interest among the employees so that they should be in the bargaining unit and bargain jointly over their working conditions. And it's really what I call it the SAMES test. Do they work at the same facility, under the same supervisor, under the same rules, park in the same parking lot, use the same lunchroom, are subject to the same wage structure, the same benefits, the same handbook policies? You get my drift, So long as they're all utilizing those same tools in terms of working in the workplace, then they probably are in an appropriate bargaining unit. So that's what we're talking about in terms of what's an appropriate unit. And that's how that's determined. And that is if there's a dispute over what is the appropriate bargaining unit, there is a hearing held before the NLRB, before a hearing officer, and both the union and the employer can put on evidence as to their respective positions. And then the regional director for the NLRB will make a ruling regarding who that voting group will be. And that will be the ultimate voting group. There's an appeal process I'm not going to bore you with, but the bottom line is, the regional director for the local office will determine what the appropriate bargaining unit is. And again, there's a tremendous amount of pre-established rules already in terms of what is an appropriate unit, but that will be the determining factor. You have an election. The election normally is held on site, although you can have mail-in ballots. That's more or less gone away now. It was very hot when COVID was around for obvious reasons, but the NLRB prefers in-person voting. The NLRB brings in one of their board agents. They have a portable voting booth they bring in and a ballot box. There's an election schedule that's set forth. There's a voter eligibility list that's reviewed and discussed among the parties as well as the NLRB to make sure the appropriate number of employees are voting. The votes are counted after the election is held, and usually, depending upon the size of the voting group, you can easily get it done within an hour. The votes are tallied right there, right after the election period is over. The votes, the paper ballots are counted immediately, and the results are immediately known. Now, again, there can be appeals based upon a number of different issues to the election process. In particular, oftentimes there are challenges as to whether or not certain employees should be allowed to vote. And if those challenges are sufficient in number that they would shift the outcome, then there has to be an investigation in terms of what the true outcome of the election is. So that might delay the ultimate outcome for many weeks. But in general, that's how the election process works. It's very simple, and normally it works pretty effectively. I talked earlier about the NLRB's general counsel who sets policy. Currently, the general counsel for the board is an individual who's a former attorney with one of the major unions in this country. She is definitely pro-union. I know it wouldn't surprise any of you given her background. She determines litigation priorities, and she right now is extremely aggressive. Yeah, I've been practicing in this area for 40 years. I've never been around a general counsel as aggressive as the current one. She has attempted to expand her jurisdiction wherever possible in terms of remedies in particular. We talked about earlier the bargaining order case and the ability to now bypass the election process, which was what was set forth in the statute, mind you, that she has totally bypassed with this new bargaining order situation. But that's how extreme she is. It's very tilted right now in favor of employees and unions. So, that's the policy we have right now. And that's the person who's in charge of policy for the most part. The general counsel has much more of a say in terms of the outcome of your organizing than anyone else because of the policy that she establishes in these situations. And the fact that the unions know that they're not going to get their hands slapped like they do in the past. So they're going to take chances they would never take in the past. And they're going to get rewarded for taking those chances. So, keep that in mind, folks. Rufino.
So now we'll talk a little bit about some of the best practices for navigating union organizing drives. And like Terry mentioned earlier, a lot of this is not sort of earth shattering. A lot of it can be really just more highlighting some of your current practices anyway. But if you do end up in a situation where a group of employees is seeking union representation, treat the other side with respect. That's the most important part here. Things tend to get heated and they sometimes escalate unnecessarily when we're talking about unions and the election process. You have to keep in mind the other side here is your employees, right? They're just seeking to potentially get a little bit more bargaining power, or they might feel that they have better strength if they present their issues to you in numbers. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's a reason why this whole process started, right? And it's not, again, not necessarily one that's based in reality, but sometimes the perception is that there was a problem at my workplace. I feel like nothing was being done to address it, and my last resort is to go seek an outside party, a union, to come in here and represent and bargain for me or on my behalf with my employer. So keep in mind that there is at least the perception that there was a problem, and they're looking for some way to address that. And that is something that in your own campaigning, right? And your strategy for a campaign can run the gamut from you sign a neutrality agreement, probably against the advice of Terry or me. But if you wanted to go that route and not take a position either way, that is one extreme. The other extreme is sort of a scorched earth. We're going to leave no stone unturned. We're going to be aggressive to hold captive audience meetings, despite all the risks that are attendant with those types of meetings under the current guidance of the general counsel. Or you can do something in between where you take a position, but you present it to your employees in a very respectful way. You express your opinion about why a union is not necessary. All of those things are at your disposal, right? Where you land in that spectrum is going to be a decision that you have to make based on your own cultural philosophy, legal risk, certainly, advice of legal counsel, in-house counsel, the concerns that your management team might have, but you do have an opportunity. I find that employers who take a more of a middle road tend to be more successful in the outcomes of a union election campaign. The scorched earth tactics don't necessarily play well with a lot of, certainly do not play well with a lot of the younger employees in your workforce. Recent college graduates tend to be already a little bit more, have more favorable views of unions. So if you've got a workforce that leans very young, that's something to take into consideration. All of those things you can assess on the front end, try to come up with a strategy that suits your workplace and your risk appetite the best. But ultimately, having some layer and some semblance of respect for the process, for the employees, for the union representatives, that really does go a long way towards making the process smooth and ideally resulting in an outcome that you can live with. One thing that I always tell clients is, don't fear the union. Be confident in the message that your management team can deliver. Be confident, especially if you've got the evidence to prove it. If your wages are at market or within a reasonable range of market rates, or maybe even a little better, don't be shy about addressing those issues and expressing your confidence in the fact that your pay is what it is and that you're competitive with any of your peers. You want to manage within the context of your organization's values, right? So again, if you have a culture of inclusiveness, a culture that values, employee opinions, you don't want to shut down discussions about these issues or give the impression that you're doing that in terms of how you manage your campaign or your response to a union election campaign. Building strong relationships with your employees is obviously going to be a key issue here. Here is where your management team plays a very critical role. Your managers know your employees better than anybody, right? They probably know who is going to favor the union versus not. Have them develop those a strong bond with those employees who probably have a favorable view of management, and without crossing any prohibited lines. And this is where legal counsel becomes very critical as well. Foster that relationship. See what you can do with that individual, where they might actually go out and deliver the message to their colleagues, which, when it comes from a coworker, tends to have a much better impact for the organization than when it comes from a manager. And ultimately, you want to use all of the resources that you have at your disposal. If you have in-house counsel, talk to them. If your C-suite team needs to be involved and wants to be involved, use them to your advantage. A lot of times, having the message delivered by somebody in the C-suite level, it shows how important the issue is to the organization as a whole, but it also gives employees this feeling that, okay, we've got their attention. What are they talking to us about now? Is there any indication from management, again, without crossing any lines or making any promises, about their receptiveness to our newfound power in our collective voice here? So again, just be thoughtful about how you do that, but don't shy away from putting out a message that you want to put out. Obviously, you do have to be careful about how that message is delivered, but you do have a story to tell. You want to take an opportunity to tell that story, and you want to do it, often and as carefully as possible.
I agree 100% with that. In fact, my experience is that employees forget about all the good things that they have. And one thing you want to do is remind them of everything that's been provided to them without a union. Go through all those handbook policies, all your benefits, all your vacation policies, all your PTO policies, all those great things that you've done for your employees, and remind them of that, because the union's going to go to negative on you, and they're going to be hyper focused on one or two things that the employees have become hyper focused on, and you need to get away from that and show the big picture to your employees, and again remind them of everything that you've done for them in the past and the present.
So we've got our second poll here. What complaint do you hear most in your workplace? You've got several options here. They're fairly general categories. Let us know what you hear the most, and Terry here after we see the results. Okay, looks like we've tapered off a little bit here, so I'm going to go ahead and let's see what we have. Wages and salary, about 58%. That's the main complaint. Inadequate benefits, nobody. Unfair treatment, lack of communication, about a quarter of you. And then other. If you want to share what your other is, please feel free to put it in the chat if you'd like. Otherwise, I will turn it back over to Terry here.
All right. Well, Christina, to answer your question, now we're going to get into the next step of this process. Once the vote is executed, and if the union wins, what happens? Well, collective bargaining happens. And some unions want to hop on it really quick and want to get to the table and start bargaining. Others are not that way. It's driven, for the most part, by what the desire of the employees have in the way of bargaining. They've got to, meet with the employees, obtain a bargaining committee to sit at the table, talk about issues they want to make priorities. They may issue an information request to the employer regarding, give us examples of all your benefits, including your SPDs. We want the names and addresses and wages for every employee covered by the collective bargaining agreement process. And so those things are usually initiated right up front within, 2 or 3 weeks of the election results. A first contract is usually a slow one to obtain. And oftentimes it can take as much as a year to get a first contract. That's how slow it is. And you're going to be talking about everything under the sun and then some. Everything covered in your handbook and everything you think you'd never thought of before. So it's a very tedious process. You want to make sure you have the right team on your side. You usually want to have some sort of HR rep at the table to make sure you're in tune with those issues. But you also need an operations person there to make sure that from a practical standpoint, what's going to work in terms of saying yes or no to the proposals that the union is submitting to you across the table. Can you do a second shift or a third shift? Can you do scheduling in a certain fashion? How are you going to go about a number of different processes? About an operations person there, it's very difficult to negotiate on those items. And again, as the slide indicates, it requires a significant investment of time by management.